Perfect. So the slide is gone, which I think means that we are ready to go. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. My name is Michael Joseph. I'm a historian here at Oxford, and I'm one of the faculty members involved with the Race and Resistance Research Programme. So I'm here just to welcome you on behalf of the programme and thank you for coming to today's event. Race and Resistance is based at Torch, the Oxford Research Centre in the Humanities, and it brings together scholars, activists, and students who are interested in the history, the literature, the cultures of anti-racist movements in the modern world. Today, we're delighted to welcome Meleisa Ono-George to Oxford ahead of her move later in the year. And she'll be in conversation today with Jade Bentil today on the politics of Black British history. So to give our speakers the introduction that they really deserve, I'm going to hand over to Kane Lewin-Turner now, who's our host for today. Kane is an MPhil student here at Oxford, working on questions of race and masculinity in modern Black British history. So Kane, over to you.
Thank you. I would like to welcome everyone again to this very special Race and Resistance event on the politics of Black British history with Dr Meleisa Ono-George. My name is Kane Lewin-Turner and I'm a history MPhil student here at Oxford. So for those who are new, Race and Resistance is an interdisciplinary program that brings together students, scholars and activists on a non-hierarchical basis to engage in the topics of racialization, racism and connected phenomena, along with the ever-present tradition of resistance. And there's perhaps no better example of this community's essence than the forthcoming conversation on Black British history. Despite decades of intellectual production on the Black British past by scholars and activists alike, its current institutional purchase and recognition are somewhat novel. Likewise, its presence in the mainstream, be that in the academy or elsewhere, is often predicated on its adherence to comfortable historiographical traditions and tropes. Most notably, the supposed predominance of the nation state, as well as masculinist excavations of the past. The richness of what is considered both Black and British history is saved only by the intervention of intersectional and radical thinkers willing to grapple with the weight and complexity of these salient narratives. So with that in mind, there are few better placed to discuss the topics of Black British history than two historians actively engaged in that dissident tradition. I'm therefore thrilled to introduce our speakers for this afternoon, Dr Meleisa Ono-George, who will be in conversation with Jade Bentil. Dr Ono-George is a social cultural historian of race, gender and sexuality, with a focus on Black women's histories in Britain and the Anglo-Caribbean. She's also a public historian with an interest in the methods and politics of historical production in Britain. Meleisa is currently Associate Professor of the University of History at the University of Warwick, but will be joining Queen's College in October as the Brittenden Fellow in Black British History. Jade Bentil is a Black feminist historian and a DPhil candidate at the University of Oxford. Her scholarship uses oral history methodologies to center the experiences of women of African and African Caribbean descent in Britain and their long history of rebellion, refusal, and resistance. Jade's debut book, Rebel Citizen, draws upon oral history interviews to explore the intimate recollections of Black women who migrated to Britain following the Second World War and will be published by Allen Lane in 2022. Before we begin, I'll briefly go over the event's format. Dr Ono-George will start with a short talk on her research, followed by a conversation with Jade Bentil, relating Dr Ono-George's research to broader issues in Black British history. After some additional questions from participants, we will then turn to the audience, so please send in any comments or questions in the chat throughout the event, and you can also upvote any questions you like, and I will direct them to the speakers. A recording of this event will be posted on YouTube, so feel free to return to or share it after the fact. With that said, I will now hand over to Dr Ono-George to begin this discussion on the politics of Black British history.
Thank you, Kane. That was a beautiful introduction. Thank you so much for that. And thank you, everyone, for inviting me to come and to speak here with you and or to have a conversation here with you. I'm really excited to be here and to be joining this very vibrant intellectual community. So I was invited to give a short introduction on my research, but I hope that we can have a much broader discussion beyond my work and beyond research in general to talk about Black history, Black British history, and Black British studies as well, more generally. So As Kane said in his introduction, I'm a historian of gender and race and sexuality. I've always researched Black women from the 18th century through to the 19th century in the Anglo-Caribbean, as well as in Britain. But my interest in history is not just about content, or even primarily about content. It's about what I would call the politics of history and historical production. By this, I mean the role of history with a capital H as a tool of change, a tool in the slow moving revolution, as Stuart Hall says, and towards justice and change. And so for me, my role as a historian is motivated by something besides intellectual curiosity. Now, don't get me wrong, I do get excited when I do get days to, just trawl through archives, dusty old common books and pages and so on, particularly when I'm successful and I find something that's useful. I know that archival joy, right? And I look forward to that archival joy, but I get just as much, if not more joy, by working collaboratively with my students, with members of the community. So at the center of my work, what moves me and what motivates me is not just intellectual curiosity, but rather love and a righteous dose of indignation. And so while I'm speaking here about my research, I should be clear that my priority is not just research or research publications in the traditional sense. I publish, and I'm grateful that I will have more time in this new role to get on with a few things. But I'm also interested in the space to further develop pedagogical and community practice. I knew I wanted to teach when I read Bell Hooks' Teach and to Transgress, 1995, when I was 15. And what she talks about there, the way that she envisions the classroom and her role as an academic, that is my model and what I am striving towards. Now that I've said that, let me outline for you a couple of the projects that I'm working on. Now, the first, my primary focus in terms of research is a book, while the other, which I'll call my beloved, is a creative community project, community engaged project that I'm actually revising slightly because of the change in my circumstances and seeking external funding for. But I would say that that secondary project is the one that is closest to my heart, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a second. So my primary focus is on writing the book, right? A monograph. And the title for that is, I don't know. I mean, the title, I'm really terrible at titles. On paper, it's called Fragmented Lives, Black Women in the Archives in 19th Century Britain, but that's probably going to change. This is a biographical study that centers on the lives of 5 Afro-Caribbean African women living in Britain from the 1780s to 1910, so over a really broad period. Besides the ways in which they have been racialized and gender, there's actually very little obvious overlap between the women that I'm focusing on. So they're from very different class backgrounds and status. 2 of the women are born into slavery, or born enslaved, right, rather, while one of them has actually inherited enslaved people. Some of them are born in Britain, while others have migrated. Some of these women are able to integrate, while others remain quite marginalized. The amount of archival documents in their lives also varies quite a bit. And like Black women's history in other parts of the diaspora, Black women's history in Britain is characterized, I think, by these kinds of omissions, the unsaid, the undocumented, the fragmented. And so the aim of this book is not to produce any kind of complete historical narrative, or to make any grand claims about women's lives, but rather the point is to put into conversation the lives of Black women standing at different places within society and at different times in history, and to consider the continuities and discontinuities in their experiences of race and gender, migration and place throughout this period of quite radical change in Britain. So this is the book. Now, the other project, which is at the forefront of my mind's eye, but not yet what I'm working directly on, is a project born out of my experience of being a new mother, far away from home and from the wisdom and care of my mother, but also my sisters, my aunties, my other mothers. And it comes out of a realization that even while we endure the legacies of slavery and colonial violence, for most of us, we have only been able to do so because of the legacies of care and nurture and community. So this project, which again, I am struggling to give any official title, but have tentatively titled Power in the Telling, A Community History of Black Mothering in Britain, is interested in the experiences and community representations of Black women and mothering in Britain from 1890 onward. And I recognize that care and nurture also comes from fathers, I should say, and from men, of course. But I think I'm correct in saying that motherhood and not even motherhood, but mothering holds a particular role within African diaspora communities. And part of this project is about unpacking some of that. And I mean, it's no surprise that the first statue of a Black woman erected in Britain, in England, is of a Black mother in Stockwell, the statue called the Bronze Woman. But the primary focus is not actually on the recovery of archives, but rather the use of those archives and the usefulness of this history within contemporary communities of Black mothers in Britain, as well as the ethics involved in the production of Black histories. And for this reason, Power in the Telling adopts a community-engaged approach and will involve a series of community-based gatherings or reasonings, we say in Jamaica, reasonings with African diasporic mothers or other mothers. And that involves us dialoguing on mothering and the role of history in the archival fragments. And this project, both in its content and its approach, really does build on the work of other Black British scholars such as Tracy Reynolds and Geraldine Brown. I want to make sure that I give that shout out. So in this project, more than my current project, I want to experiment with historical method and consider how we can disrupt the assumed authority of the researcher, the academic, and the exclusion of non-academic communities from historical production. And so those who decide to participate will be invited to engage in a process of digital storytelling to produce their own mothering stories, which draws upon their knowledges and memories of mothering, but also centers their interpretations of the archival records. These mothering stories will bring the past into conversation with the present and in consideration of the future by creating an archive of Black women's and mothers' lives, a step towards, I think, redressing some of the omissions and silences of Black British women within the archives. Now, in terms of university speak, this is probably considered an impact or engagement project. However, I'm hoping that it will actually contribute to efforts being made by a number of historians and scholars looking to challenge the boundaries of current historical practice and to push against those boundaries to carve out spaces that allows for histories of the marginalized or the archivally dispossessed. And in this way, this project is also about the institution, I think, and about the field of history more generally. So as a way of conclusion and summary, let me outline quickly the questions that are shaping the work that I'm doing, and not just my research, but just my work in general. So the first question, what are the experiences of women of African ancestry in Britain? And not just sort of radical, not exceptional, just the everyday, the complex, the problematic, the insignificant. What are the everyday ways in which these women lived, and how do we continue to live within and beyond the confines of white supremacy and patriarchy? The second question, what are the legacies and the discontinuities of survival, of care and nurture, the politics of care, I would say, that continue to inform Black communities in Britain, and legacies that connect us not only to our past, but also to each other across the diaspora? How can historians creatively engage with and make use of archival fragments and silences and omissions? How can this history be made to speak to the present and in our imaginings of the future? And finally, my last question, how can we produce history, particularly histories about communities that have been and continue to be socially marginalized and discriminated against, that is not just ethical, but also reparative? Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for that kind of really beautiful overview of your work, Dr. Ono-George. I was just kind of like spellbound listening, just because there are so many kind of like, I think, conceptual links between the kind of work that I'm interested in doing at the moment and the kind of historical recovery that you've kind of been mapping over the past few years. I was particularly interested, I guess, in, you know, your focus on Black women's lives, specifically within the British context, because, you know, as you mentioned, Black women's lives have been kind of, you know, over the course of so many centuries, you know, really undocumented, very much erased within history with a capital H, as you mentioned. So I was kind of interested in, I guess, the research that you've been doing on Black women's lives, specifically, you know, Black women of African descent in Jamaica, and the forms of kind of like sex work and erotic labor that you were kind of focusing when you were doing your kind of own doctoral research, and how I guess the kind of conditions that they were navigating in the kind of like 18th and 19th centuries kind of like repeat into the present. And then I guess alongside that, what are the ways that Black women rebelled, that challenge, how do they challenge this kind of like infrastructure of racial slavery and empire, and how might that inform how we kind of can continue that sort of kind of rebellion, that history of resistance in the present?
Yeah. So, right. So the women that I focused on in my PhD, so two groups of women, I suppose, generally. So I focused on women who had relationships with, or sexual relationships of varying degrees of consent, I should say, or non-consent with white men, but also women who engaged in sexual labor in the practice that later then gets called prostitution, right? And I mean, how would I describe that? Very, very messy and very, very complex. And I think what came out for me, what was very striking for me, was the ways in which the way that women were able to live did not fit within any neat category, right? Like they weren't just victims of a system, right? They on the other hand, they weren't also resistors of it, like they didn't fit neatly into any of these kind of categories that I think in a lot of the literature you see, right? So we want them to fit into those categories, but actually their lives are much more messy than that, much more complicated, and they're sort of negotiating these sort of different spaces quite a bit. And so but I think the other thing that was striking to me was sort of the ingenious, sometimes creative ways in which women negotiated and navigated the different kinds of inequalities and the different kinds of structures set against them. In Jamaica, we talk about make and do, right? You have to do, you're going to make do. And you see that. So I saw that so profoundly in the archives with with many of the women that I was looking at, right? That, if one thing is, right, so fine, they're not able to do this one thing, then they're going to do this other thing, right? And they might be, they might be cussing somebody out this day, but then they might actually be, sort of trying to get something else from that same person another day. And that was just, it's all a part of that negotiation, I think, and that navigation. I think the point, though, is to survive, is to live, right? And to not just for themselves, but for their families. And that was the other thing that was really striking, right? It's like, it is not just about thinking about like those in their immediate, so not just their children, not just themselves, right? But also almost like thinking ahead. Yeah. And so, I feel like I'm going on a tangent, right? I'm losing track of what I was saying, right? And so, I suppose these are the lessons, and I think these are the lessons for us, though. Right? And I see this in my own family, my own family's history, is this way in which, like, whatever laws are being put into place, whatever restrictions are put, what I see are people who are finding ways to live beyond those things. And they challenge them, like people will go out on protests and things like that, but we'll also ignore those laws when we have to. And, you can sort of see this during that period as well, I think. And so, yeah, I mean, when I talk about sort of the legacies of care and nurture and things like that, I mean, it's also a legacy of survival, these sort of techniques that I think that certainly I see, particularly amongst Black women historically.
Yeah, I think, Black women have had to find these really kind of like creative ways to navigate this kind of like ongoing context of unfreedom, and it really fascinates me. I've kind of been trying to grapple with that sort of entanglement in my own work recently, kind of mapping this kind of like history of reproductive injustice that Black women, Black mothers have faced, and kind of complicating that idea of agency, this kind of idea that, like you said, there's this kind of, you know, you rebel against this and you have a free choice. Like, you know, what do you do when you don't have a choice? How do you make your way out of no way? So yeah, I'm really kind of trying to sit with that tension, and the fact that there, you know, the ways that we have had to historically, you know, try and find modes of survival aren't kind of, like you said, kind of clean cut, and this kind of, you know, can't necessarily fit into this grammar of resistance and rebellion, without looking at the wider context in which people's choices, people's opportunities are being kind of like curtailed and limited.
Absolutely. And it's always, it's not always, I mean, it's difficult, right? Like it's really, so with the project on mothering, so one of the reasons I'm focusing on mothering as well is because, like, how do you translate that then into the way that you care for your children, or for the children in your community, right? Like how do you teach that? Like how do you pass that down? What are the ways, and the, you know, and what does that do? What does that do to women? You know, like what is the sort of emotional and the mental toll that kind of constant negotiation and that constant sort of filtering and that constant, like, what does that do to us?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I actually had a really kind of like incredible experience where I was doing an oral history interview a couple of years ago with a woman who migrated to Britain as, you know, a child during the kind of so-called like Windrush generation. She came over as a 5-year-old and was very much talking about that experience of being a kind of, you know, so-called like barrel child, someone that was kind of, you know, because of the necessities of like economic migration and that kind of history of empire, was, you know, left behind with her grandmother whilst her parents came to Britain and set up their lives. And the kind of like fractures that emerged in that kind of like relationship once she was reunited with her parents. And she said this really incredible thing where she said, you know, her mother was having to care for other people, you know, like, you know, her labor was being used to kind of, you know, I guess stabilize this national project that has, you know, hurt Black people in so many different ways, and in being kind of used to stabilize that national project, you know, that mother-daughter relationship was completely strained. So she was saying, you know, people kind of eulogize Black women saving the NHS and coming to Britain and doing all of this care work, but at what cost? You know, what cost to their lives, cost to their families, you know, cost to everything that makes them who they are. And it really was just kind of like a, you know, like show-stopping moment where I really had to sit with that tension and what this, you know, this, like I said, kind of ongoing infrastructure of unfreedom has cost Black women as well.
Absolutely. And then of course the larger impacts within our communities, right? Like, and you know, and absolutely.
Yeah. You know, during your talk, I was also just kind of like really interested in the kind of more community-based research that you're kind of trying to do at the moment, which I absolutely love, just because it completely just feels very kind of anti-institutional in you know, a really kind of beautiful way. It's not about kind of like folding the work that you're doing back into a, you know, purely institutional context, but it is about kind of, you know, reaching outside of the academy, looking at the modes of kind of like recovery and archival practices of communities beyond that institutional kind of architecture. So I guess I kind of wanted to ask you a bit more about, you know, the kind of methodologies of historical recovery that you've drawn upon within your own work, and how other scholars who are working on minoritized communities might also draw upon those sorts of methodologies, so that we don't kind of replicate the harm that, you know, the academy has traditionally done to Black communities in particular.
I mean, I think that I mean, it's been really difficult here, I think, actually, to do this kind of work, and it's been actually incredibly difficult to do this kind of work because it becomes because it's not considered the main research of any sort, right? Like, it's not like your research has to be archive based. It has to be about, it's about you working on your own, right? Like, it's And then you are the expert, you go and you do your interpretation, and then you tell us what you found. And then if you're going to do public history, then you go out and you tell the public what you found, right? And that is sort of the general model. And so I did my master's in Canada, on the west coast of Canada. And God, I think that opened my eyes to a different way of doing research, particularly people working, Indigenous scholars working on Indigenous histories, right? Have shown me a very different way, a potential way of doing history, and thinking ethically and creatively about ways that we can do that, and its purpose within our communities. And I've tried to take that when I, coming back here, I've tried to take that and to think about that in my research. And in terms of practical things, dialogue is so, I think about Groundings with My Brothers, Walter Rodney, Groundings with My Brother, who says, like, you have to come out of the academy if you're going to do this work, right? Like, if you feel uncomfortable talking to people, going to community centers and talking to people, then maybe this is not the work for you. Or, hold on, maybe this is only one form of work, right? But for me, this is important. Yeah. For me, the dialogue outside of academy is important. It's also about like the audience, right? So I'm not finding my audience within the university. And I think we really do, whatever research you're doing, I think you do need to think about who you're speaking to. And so for me, if you're thinking that your work is for that your work is primarily about Black British communities, and you're thinking about that as you're at the forefront of your work, right? Then you have to dialogue with Black people. And I don't mean that one group of, that one friend or that one group of Black people that, like, I mean, just quite broadly, and you need to be open to that. So, so seeking the opportunities to do that, I think, is really important. Having those, groundings and is really important. And then listening as well. And listening to, to what people are saying in response to the work that you're thinking about doing, but also even to your ideas. So being willing to be directed by, some of the work that that people that you're engaging with are saying is needed, right? And that they want to see. But also, I think, connected to that, and I think this is often the most difficult part, is being willing to step aside or to put things down. And I can't, like, particularly with white scholars doing work in Black histories, I think that sometimes you do need to ask yourself whether or not this particular area, and I don't mean Black history in general, I mean, like, whatever you're looking at within that, whether this is something that you should be doing, whether you should be doing it now. Like thinking about the current politics and what's happening. Are these things that you should be saying? Right? Don't come to me with, well, this is just what the archive said, because that's not, like, it's more complicated than that. There are politics in what you produce and how you write those things. And I think you need to be very mindful of things. And it's the same thing like with archives, right? So, just because you found something in the archive, doesn't mean it's yours. Sorry, right? Like, it's not finders keepers, right? This is not what we're playing at. So, and so thinking about whether or not, like, do you want to tell people about that? And I understand that the university, academia creates a culture in which, it's competitive, and we're, someone's going to steal your work if you're talking about, if you talk about your work, you shouldn't be sharing. And of course that happens. And unfortunately, that happens probably most to, like, junior scholars, certainly women, certainly scholars of color, right? I know that happens. But in a way, that then sets up a kind of culture that is counter to what I think the larger project is, right? In terms of, like, access, and in terms of accessibility, in terms of, the kinds of conversations and dialogue that we want to have beyond the university. And so, so yeah, I'm not certain if I answered your question or not. No.
No, I was kind of just like, even just, listening to you just now, I was really interested in, because obviously we know that there's been really kind of painful and kind of hyper extractive history around kind of like communities of color, you know, Black communities in particular, and white scholars doing their research and kind of, you know, treating Black people's lives as these kind of like archaeological ruins that they can kind of like peer in and they can kind of, you know, loop from, essentially. I was also interested though, like even, you know, as Black scholars within the academy, how do we kind of, you know, what ways can we maybe circumvent the kind of demand to kind of parrot that sort of kind of hyper extractive relationship? Because, you know, I never take for granted, even as a Black woman scholar who's doing work on Black women, you know, I can still, if I don't kind of have that constant process of kind of like accountability, you know, being in conversation with like, you know, people both within and outside academia, to make sure that I'm not also kind of replicating those really kind of like harmful dynamics. So how do we as well kind of, you know, make sure that we are kind of being accountable to our communities, that we're not kind of like causing harm, and kind of parroting that hyper extractive relationship?
So, I mean, I think it is exactly as you said, is to, I mean, that constant reflection about what you're doing and how you're going about doing it, I think is incredibly important. And so I have found that, so the only way that I'm going to be able to do the Mother-in project in a way that I want to do it is if I write this book and I get this book out. And I get that out and it's there, right? And that's done. And I feel like, in a sense, it's almost like that is me doing something for the, like, I'm going to check that box, right? So you can get off my back now and let me get on with it, you know? And so I don't have that pressure to, you know, to produce something in the ways that in the confines in which the academy might want me to do it. But also I think for me, it's making sure that the Mother-in project is partially directed by the people actually, the mothers involved in the project, and that there's still space there for that. And making sure that that's actually built into some, you know, like that is there. And so, and I don't know if that's going to work, you know, like who knows, right? But it is part of that constant reflection and thinking about like what I'm doing. And there have been projects, I have been involved in projects in the past where I've just had to step out because it just didn't feel, it didn't feel right.
Yeah. It definitely kind of like feels like trial and error sometimes as well, where, you know, there's a constant kind of like process of like ethically checking in, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know,
absolutely.
yourself and other people, to make sure that, like I said, you're not kind of like replicating, you know, these kind of like really harmful dimensions of like academic research.
Absolutely.
But I guess kind of like leading on from that, I was, you know, really interested. I had a conversation earlier this year with Dr. Kenetta Perry, and, you know, we kind of like briefly touched on the positionality of like, you know, Black women academics in the academy. And, you know, I guess that kind of often quoted, you know, figure where it's like, I mean, I haven't kept up with it now, but I know definitely like a couple of years ago, it was like 28 Black women professors in the whole of the UK. I don't know what it is now. So I just kind of wanted to ask you to speak a bit to your experiences as a Black woman academic, specifically in the British Academy. I guess the demands that are made of your labour, how you might be in community with other, you know, Black women or like scholars of colour to kind of, you know, challenge those dynamics and imagine something different.
So I definitely have my crew, right? Like I have my group of Black women, but also women of color historians in this country. We all work in this country. And actually they're a really good checkpoint for me. And sometimes I have to run things, sorry, just going back to your last question, touch on the last question, right? Like that is actually one of the things I do, is to check in with them when I feel like I'm being asked to do something that doesn't, you know, I'm not certain about, this does not feel right, I check in, I have to check in with them. But I would say to everyone, that's how I think I've been able to get through, really. Isolation is terrible. Isolation is, you know, I mean, I don't think I'd be able to, I don't think I'd still be an academic, actually. I don't think I'd still be in the institution if I wasn't able to have that group of people. And And actually in the early stages, I would say students as well. Like a lot of Black female students that I've connected with who've been quite important in terms of creating a community and creating just a space to be, right? And so yeah, like, how's it been for me? It is hard, right? Because like as a Black woman, as a woman and as a Black woman, I think that we're often, if we're not being ignored, then we're being undermined, or our work is being undervalued until it's, suddenly sexy. Suddenly someone discovers something, and it's like, a lot have been saying that. Listening to it. And I mean, that can have such a unbelievable toll on like your sense of self and like your well-being and everything else. And so having that group of people, having a network of people that you trust and that, who you don't have to explain it all to, like you're already starting. So yeah. So I think part of my, I see this actually as part of my role. So in the same way I see myself as doing as a researcher, is also about creating those networks for other scholars, other Black scholars.
Absolutely. No, I'm so glad that you mentioned like your crew, because my friends and I, we're always talking about the power of the group chat. Like, we've got kind of like a group chat of us who are all kind of like Black women academics, normally at kind of like master's and PhD level, and we kind of constantly have that thing where we've been offered an opportunity or we're thinking of something and we like put it past each other. We're like, what do you think? Like, like is this a good move, or is this actually me? Is my integrity intact? Yeah. And it's always helpful. It's always helpful because they've definitely saved me from making some decisions that like actually, in hindsight definitely would have been wise. So it's just kind of beautiful to see those like flourish.
Absolutely. I mean, it's, it's sort of like how your family, well, for some people anyway, certainly in my case, my family has been really important in keeping me on course and grounded, right? Like, Melissa, who you are, and in a way like that, my academic community has done that as well. Right. And so, yeah, I think that's really important to have that,
Yeah, no, as I was actually saying the other day to one of my friends that, just like you were saying in terms of your family, each time I ring my grandma, she answers the phone and, her first thing to say to me is, oh, so have you finished the book yet? Like, have you finished the book? Like, definitely a like regimented system of accountability where I'm like, yeah, okay, I'm at my desk, don't worry. The page is open, I'm getting to it. I guess, before I bring Kane back in, I just had kind of like one final question. There's just been so much excitement around, your appointment at Oxford as an associate professor who will be focusing on like Black British history specifically. And I guess what this means and the rest of these kind of appointments that are kind of happening across the kind of entire edifice of the British Academy, what this might mean for the field. So I kind of wanted to ask you, about your kind of view of these sorts of appointments that have been kind of happening over the past kind of year or two, and what you envisage being able to do in that capacity.
So, I mean, in terms of, so on one hand, I'm part of what I plan to do when I start is to sort of learn the lay of the land, right? Is to get a sense of what is already happening. And, because I think that there has been a lot of work being done, it sounds like mostly students, but also some faculty at Oxford. And I want to make sure that, so I'm not going to be like, this is what I'm going to do at Oxford, right? Like, I'm going to see what's happening first. But I think more generally, what I'd like to do is to start building some of these networks. And for me, the objective is to build critical mass, right? So the more, like, people keep talking about the pipeline, the more undergraduates we have doing graduate work, doing postgraduate work, getting positions, the better, as far as I'm concerned, right? So I'm very much about like how, well, right now I'm sort of helping some people with applications and things like that, and and so for me that's my primary focus. And actually, I've been in conversation with a few people about planning sort of like a workshop of some sort at Oxford for people working on Black British history, graduate students and and academics, established academics, but also people doing community histories as well, right? I think it'd be really great to bring people together and to actually start workshopping our papers and things like that, right? So what are we working on? What are the questions that we're asking? Can we publish together? What kind of collaborative work can we do together? So that is my plan, right? It's about collaboration. It's about critical mass, building critical mass.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to that kind of like collaborative energy and just kind of seeing what happens. Kane, hello. I'm going to kind of like hand over to you now. I know you've got a kind of couple of questions to ask Dr. Ono-George as well.
Thanks, Anna. I hate to interrupt powerful conversation. I'm really glad that this is going on to YouTube. I feel like that conversation is kind of like could be a resource for Black women, but people of color more broadly, looking at this kind of work and the problems one encounters and you know the means to get beyond that. Yeah, it was so good to hear. And I want to stay on this topic, and I should just say before I get on to my questions, if anyone has any questions, any thoughts, please put them in the chat, and I will direct them to the speakers. But I want to stay on this topic of dealing with the present in history and shunning that norm. And if you feel like you're, and obviously that's necessary when you're dealing with the kind of narratives you are with that kind of legacy and that hold that kind of weight in the present. And so I was wondering if you feel like your engagement with public history, going beyond that kind of very traditional kind of hidebound idea of the historian, has allowed you to do that, and what would be your advice to kind of a generation of people looking to do Black British history in this environment that seems more conducive to making it happen?
Yeah, so I mean, I feel like Black British history is necessarily very much about the present. Like, I feel like you have to sort of, you know, so the sort of traditional sort of discourse on history that it's something, you know, like you shouldn't be, it is just about the archives. It's about the, you know, it's about the past and that kind of thing doesn't work in Black British history. Actually, it doesn't work with anything, really. I think that's like one of the sort of fictions of history. So yeah, so I don't actually take any notice of that, clearly, in terms of my work, right? That's something that I ignore. But in terms of, so Ken, the second part of your question is about advice.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm saying is there seems to be more, with positions like yours, more people being supervised under, you know, under people who are willing to kind of give this narrative a chance. And so and so how can we, you know, exist in that without kind of engaging in what has made other aspects of history not have its live up to its capacity to impact change in the present, and kind of that kind of still whole idea of, like, you know, the university is a kind of critical or nothing, and so and what is, you know, history or cultural studies, what's it for? So, and how I guess my personal question, how do we deal with that reality? How do we justify our amount of time spent in libraries, basically? Yeah,
absolutely. So I mean, so I'm in a very privileged, I mean, we're all in very privileged positions to be when we're, you know, to be in the university, I think, right? We sort of hold, but I'm certainly in a position where my graduate students aren't. And there's certainly some hoops that that I no longer have to jump through, although I have other kinds of hoops that I have to jump through, but there's certain hoops that I don't have to, that my graduate students do have to, you know, and students coming up have to jump through. And for me, it's about knowing the lay of the land, right? So you know the hoop that you have to jump through, right? So you know that you have to do this, this, and this, but how else can you, like, what are the other, that still leaves quite a bit that you can work with, that you can work beyond. And so I think it's about sort of being, I mean, it's certainly finding a community and certainly finding a supervisor, if you can, that is willing to support that, right? But being willing to be experimental and to be creative in the ways that you're thinking, not just the content, again, not just the content, but even the way that you're presenting your work, you know? The kind of research, like who you're speaking to, all of these kinds of things is, you know, thinking beyond and creatively, I think, is really important. But certainly knowing the lay of the land, right? Because, and I'm saying, I often say this to my students. I have 2 PhD students who are doing Black British projects in Black British history. I have to say this to them. It's like, yeah, you know that is bullshit, and like we both agree on that, but there are still going to be people examining you on that bullshit. So you make sure you know that bullshit, right? And then you can sort of work beyond that as well. I feel like I'm not answering your question, Kate. But
that's great advice. And I guess moving from the kind of temporal elements into spatial, you don't work on just Britain or just the Caribbean. And I guess there has been, as I spoke about in the introduction, a kind of a nationalizing of this very transnational and just kind of diasporic existence and experience and history. I was wondering, that's another, I guess, norm that you have actively tried to subvert, and how that relates to your focus on Black women, because you talk about care, and I guess you've experienced care and seen care in so many different, kind of national contexts, and so to what extent is that kind of going beyond the nation related to your focus, your specifically gendered focus?
I mean, there's lots of different ways I suppose I can answer this question, but one of the things that strikes me quite often is the ways in which I feel like Black communities, Black women in the African diaspora are a part of a constant migration, right? Like we're moving, we seem to be moving in spaces quite a bit, in these different sort of spaces. And that disrupts quite a bit. It disrupts the kinds of it disrupts spaces of support that and that we can draw on often, I think, and forces us in lots of ways, I think, to rethink and to recreate these kinds of spaces in different kinds of ways. And so the ideas of like nation doesn't, but I suppose as a part of that disruption, and a part of that sort of rethinking and that movement is also then about challenging certain ideas of what the nation is and what it means to be, say, for instance, British, right? Like, because we're not just, so within the community, like it's never just a British community. You're always a diasporic community, I think. And I think many people, certainly in the Caribbean, have family, for instance, across the diaspora. And so this idea of Britishness is never something that's fixed in any kind of way. And it's really about sort of the recreation within these local spaces as we're moving through and beyond them, I think, drawing from each other as well, quite a bit.
Yeah. And I guess, Jade, I wanted to kind of see if you could pick up on that, because obviously in your work, you're dealing with both African and Afro-Caribbean people and some women. So I guess you probably have different kind of recollections of diasporic experiences. So you must be consistently kind of coming across something that completely dismantles this idea that there is a Black British experience that is neat enough to call it that.
Absolutely. My work is definitely kind of like grappling with this kind of tension of being, a kind of like diasporic kind of, person. I don't want to say subject because that's just a whole nother thing, but, a kind of someone who has, kind of migrated to Britain, or might be a descendant of someone that migrated to Britain, and the ways that we've kind of created kinship and community out of those kind of ongoing processes of migration. Part of the reason why I wanted to write Rebel Citizen was because I feel like there's this very dominant narrative about migration to Britain, what it looks like. It's very masculinist in terms of, the kind of trajectory that it maps usually. That kind of, I guess, iconography of that image of, the Windrush arriving with, all of these men in suits as being the kind of definitive picture of an entire kind of generation, I think has really overdetermined some of the narratives that we see about Black migration to Britain. I think, there's a tendency, and I think it's really easy to do. And I've definitely had to make sure within my own work that I don't replicate this myself. But there's a tendency to sometimes, even as we're mapping these forms of rebellion, we're mapping these tensions, there's a tendency sometimes to fall back into a desire for national inclusion, a desire for kind of national recognition that I kind of see across that narrative of kind of post 1948, you know, migration. So in speaking to the women, it's just been so beautiful to hear some of their desires that, you know, they don't even mention being British, they don't mention being a citizen, which is, you know, what the book is exploring. They're finding other ways of existing in the world, other ways of loving, other ways of, you know, finding community with other people that are not predicated on being a kind of subject citizen or, you know, kind of fulfilling these demands of being a kind of, you know, good immigrant, so to speak. And then, you know, alongside that, when we're talking about migration, I've spoken to women whose parents were in Britain in, you know, the 1930s, the 1940s, who had this kind of long ongoing history of, you know, migration to Britain because of, you know, 4 centuries of kind of racial slavery and colonial rule. So I think all of those narratives fundamentally challenge, you know, what we're understanding as being, like you said, a kind of Black British community, and also, you know, something beyond that, what exceeds the nation, what exceeds, you know, like I said, this kind of demand to perform a certain kind of labor or to perform a kind of certain type of kind of respectable citizenship. So, you know, talking to women, I've spoken to women who were drag queens, women who were sex workers, women who had, you know, backstreet abortions and found really creative ways to engage with this, you know, ongoing project of reproductive justice. So just all of those formations for me are what constitute diaspora, and they're always shifting. Sorry, really long answer. I get really excited when I have an opportunity to talk about this because I spend so many days at my laptop just kind of like by myself, willing myself to like write this book and finish it. So it's always great to kind of have that conversation.
I think that something I want to pick up on this, you talk about the kind of this desire, you've often found a kind of this desire for British identity that's not present in your work, but a lot of historians have tried to find, and that kind of, I guess this gets to the heart, one of the, aside with the, along with the nation state, where the politics of Black British history is, and what's progress, and progress has been defined by male standards consistently throughout this kind of historical endeavor. And so what does progress look like, Black progress look like when you center Black women? I guess that's a question to both of you. Meleisa, if you want to start off.
What is progress? Oh, wow. Kane, I feel like that's a huge question, right?
So, for example, I was talking about a book which saw the process to wage labor as progress, and obviously from a certain perspective, wage labor is not progress. And so, a lot of historians have kind of put these ideas of progress kind of very covertly in their text. They're kind of assumed, and I feel like in a gendered context, it can often be that what a Black man would consider to be progress does not carry over. And so does that, and I'm not asking you so much what does progress look like, but how does that discussion change when we center Black women? If that's more manageable, sorry.
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah.
Okay, so what I guess in terms of this idea of progress, I kind of have a really antagonistic relationship to the entire notion of progress, because I think even in its corporality, it feels very masculinist, it feels very linear, you know? And I think what mapping these histories of Black women shows me is that, you know, as Meleisa and I were kind of talking about earlier, there's that entanglement, right? There's not this kind of like forward march, like each generation we get closer to freedom. Like, you know, freedom is something that is being waged right now in the present. We are kind of trying to grapple with that right now. And we have been, you know, over the course of centuries. So, you know, this is not me saying that like things haven't changed or anything like that. But what I am saying is that this idea of like this kind of like, you know, slow march forward, you do this, you get this Black person here, and then we kind of win this, and then that's over. Like, I think revolution is definitely more complicated than that. So I think, you know, kind of listening to Black women's stories and looking at the way that like freedom has been kind of like interdicted, but at the same time that their forms of, like I said, kind of kinship, their forms of imagining their lives has kind of exceeded the boundaries of a kind of like national imperial project, I think kind of necessarily complicates this idea of a kind of, you know, forward progress for Black communities.
Yeah, I'm struggling, I think, partially because it's so hard to imagine.
Yeah.
And I think that's, I mean, and because it's, yeah, like, I think that's why I'm struggling, because it's this hard thing to even, because it seems to be any kind of progress, it seems, it's never just progress, right? Like, it's always these small sort of wins. It's these small things that we can just sort of, you know, that like, so where we can be free. And I suppose the word that keeps coming back to me in my head is rest, right? Like, where we could just sort of be, where people can, where we can be, and whatever that means. But yeah, I don't know, because I think like, even for me, even me thinking like personally, I cannot imagine it, and what progress looks like, even from, you know, for Black women. I can't think of what that, and maybe that's it. Maybe it's at a time when, maybe that's progress, when we can actually imagine.
And that's, yeah, it's really interesting to hear, and I guess it's also, I guess, positive in a sense that in both your works you won't be kind of prescribing it and kind of putting it down in the way that some histories have, as in that you mark points of progress with such clarity, because it's not the case in the kind of historical narratives that we are dealing with. Just we'll have to wrap up soon. If there are any kind of closing remarks that either of you have about the broader topic of the kind of the politics of history and going forward, as well as going backwards, if either of you have anything to say about the kind of contours of Black British history you want to see in the future, if that makes sense.
So I'm quite inspired. I'm quite inspired by the potential of Black British history to transform history in general, right? And the way that the way that we approach studies in general, right? So it's not just about, and I suppose this is what has been actually happening in the past, right? Like, so it's not just about Black people at all. And I think that's really quite hopeful. And I'm really inspired by, and even in terms of like how we work. So the collaborative way of working, for instance, or the things that we're focused on, dialogue and things like that, I think has this incredible potential in that, particularly in this time, this, you know, our current context, which is quite gloomy, I think, and can be really difficult. I think it's, yeah, I don't know, I feel like it's a hopeful time in terms of Black British history and studies and history in general.
Yeah, I'll just really quickly say, I'm really excited to see Black scholars draw upon these kind of methodologies that have, you know, typically kind of been denigrated within the academy, or, you know, haven't kind of been encouraged amongst us, you know, oral history methodologies, you know, whatever else is kind of going on. There's so many different formations and ways of kind of doing that archival research. For example, I've been using critical fabulation, which is something that Saidiya Hartman uses to kind of, you know, I guess, produce counter narratives to the very kind of like violent imposition of history as a discipline on Black women. So, you know, I know, Meleisa, a couple of your kind of like PhD students who I know as well, who are doing like really incredible projects, you know, on kind of Black LGBTQ history, for example, and like Rastafarianism, like all of these sorts of histories that can't comfortably sit inside the dominant narrative are always super exciting to me.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I kind of share the collective optimism, and I think this conversation has been so good at showing that side of it, as well as the problems that are encountered and the norms we are struggling against. And as I said before, this is going to be such a fantastic resource for people looking to do that this work. So thank you so much, and I'd like to thank Torch, the race and resistance community, especially Iyone, our technician Sarah, Dr. Mike Joseph, and Jade, Bentil, and Dr. Meleisa Ono-George for such a wonderful afternoon. And please check the Race and Resistance Facebook page for future events. And yeah, I hope this was as enjoyable for everyone else as it was for me. And I think it's fair to say that we can, it's been demonstrated that the future of Black British history is in very safe hands. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.